Welcome to the Tank Magazine podcast. I'm Josie Mitchell. Today we're bringing together a handful of Tank staffers to chat about the Venice Biennale. Here with me are Mackinnon-Little and Christabel Stewart, our arts editor. We're keen to debrief about what we thought of the exhibition, what we liked, what we didn't, and how it compares to the other years. We all attended the opening of the Venice Biennale, I think a couple of weeks ago.
Indeed.
And have had some time to let it mull, and we thought we'd come together and talk a little bit about what we thought about the exhibition and whether there were some particular things that stood out and sort of have stayed in our memory, essentially. So yeah, we were, first of all, what were everyone's first impressions? Guy, I think it was your first time at the Biennale?
Yeah, I mean the overall experience, I guess, is just sort of structured by this kind of onslaught of visual information. The kind of encapsulating image that sort of really stayed with me was just like everyone just taking pictures of the artist texts and then just like getting on to the next thing as quickly as possible.
It's just if you were going to describe it for someone who's never been before, if there was just like this sort of like simplistic like structure as a whole, what would you say? There's Arsenale,
right,
which is one building. There's another area called the Giardini.
Yeah, so the exhibition is set up in such a way, the main exhibition, that it's divided between these two spaces, which are labelled Proposition A, Proposition B. There's a sort of frequent reoccurrence of artists across the two spaces, so the sort of, quite often there'll be like a new work in the one and an older work in the other, or two works which are sort of very unrelated, or works which speak together in a particular kind of way. I guess the way it works is you go and sort of spend one day sort of wandering around the one, and then the next day you'll be at the other, and there'll be this sort of weird resonance that hits where you sort of recognize something, or there's disjunction between an artist you saw in the other space.
Can I interject?
Yeah,
I think this is the first time, as far as I understand, that somebody's used the Arsenale, which are all, as far as I understand, shipbuilding buildings. They're on a grand scale, but you can basically curate a group show that kind of continues in and out of these different buildings and on a very long meandering tour. But then what Ralph Rogoff did this time was then to mirror that again in the official Italian pavilion, which is given over to the curated part, and he gave each of the artists a second chance to a second work, so you're not just seeing one group show, one installation or piece by each artist. You get two goes. So Ralph Rogoff cut the number of artists significantly down to 80, of which 50% were female, which has been noted as a laudable thing to do. And yeah, did this interesting kind of mirroring structure.
And he called them sort of Proposition 1 and Proposition B. I think it took me a while to figure out that was what was going on. I think I went through the Arsenale and I didn't realise that was what he was doing. And then sort of had that experience quite organically where I went into the other space in the Giardini and I sort of started recognising the same artists. And the thing that I was struck by was actually they were really different. I think a few people have commented on the fact that it gave the artists a chance to try something really, really, that they might not necessarily be known for with their second piece of, with their Proposition B. I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I think that's a very generous structure to give people. And I don't know how tested that is in a kind of group show. I mean, obviously in certain shows, museum or contemporary art spaces, you may have several opportunities to see one artist in a space, but in Venice, I think it is kind of a useful echo, isn't it, to understand something through two works rather than one.
Yeah. And I guess that might be a sort of a useful pivot to the sort of overall curatorial statement where the exhibition was titled May You Live in Interesting Times, which is borrowed from this misquoted ancient Chinese curse, first uttered in the 30s by British MP Sir Austen Chamberlain. So that was sort of responsive to this sort of pre-war era of uncertainty and sort of cultural turbulence and political kind of, restlessness. And I guess it's a sort of phrase which is maybe intended to sort of index this kind of moment of chaotic present, and I guess in terms of the sort of what that looks like in terms of the art practices that are being called attention to, it's sort of artists working with alternative identities or sort of other worlds, or this kind of like broader theme of kind of multiplicity and sort of ambiguity. I think there was a pull quote I saw from Ralph somewhere, which was like why ambiguity is like the defining aesthetic of the present or something. So it's this kind of indeterminacy, I guess.
I think that's quite generous. May You Live in Interesting Times. I wasn't a huge fan of that as a title.
I wasn't either.
You weren't either.
Although
What
I like
did
the
you think
second
it?
bit of the quote, if this is correct, we move from one crisis to another, we suffer one disturbance and shock after another.
Right, so yeah, we've got this. We've sort of taken the. We've gone to the original source of the quote, which continues to that line that Chamberlain says afterwards, one crisis to another. Yeah, I guess when you sort of recontextualize it, it's quite. But then I guess what does "May you live in interesting times" mean? I sort of thought it's sort of like you can imagine the word "interesting" in quote marks, like, oh, well, this is interesting.
Yeah.
Which can sort of be. Is it like a sub? Is it sort of like a?
It risks being quite trivializing, I guess.
Yeah.
Like these are, I guess, interesting times, but that also, it felt like it was avoiding just saying we're living in crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose that the sort of response which comes out in the second part of that quote is that it would feel really, really difficult and perhaps even impossible to sort of single out anything as like a sort of defining topic which is going to capture the sort of zeitgeist or whatever. So it's almost like he sort of dodges that problem by just saying like, well, you can't talk about any particular thing because there's so much. So I'm just going to like...
But I do see what you mean if you come up with a very broad umbrella of we could be in a crisis. I felt maybe that, you know, by saying, okay, there's 50% women, there was a lot of representation of artists from, you know, internationally all over. It was very carefully kind of balanced in that way, but that doesn't necessarily, you know, which is generous and good, but it doesn't necessarily make for an interesting exhibition.
I feel like I remember when we walked round together, you said that. I think I'm trying to remember what your first like takeaway comment was. Can you remember, Guy?
It was
something like I think that you said you felt it was a bit cold.
That was it. Cold. I was
said-
freezing cold by the end.
You were physically cold, but then maybe there was. You thought there was maybe a bit of a. It was a bit cold. The actual art that came together and.
I did feel that really strongly, and I'm glad you remembered that because I don't know why. I felt that. I mean, one example I have was something that I became familiar with because it was shown in London. Ed Atkins, who's really well known for a sort of CGI film and a lot of text work, and he'd brought together this incredible archive of opera costumes. I can't remember from which institution. I think there was a different display, but the clothing was there. But it was shown in darkness, so I felt quite confused by why you do that. And having said that, I spoke to somebody who'd been involved in showing it in London, and they were quite tickled to see this in a very different context, so to give it a different atmosphere. But I found it quite confusing and a bit off-putting. And I'm not saying everything. Obviously, that was a very specific example, and you know, I did know that artwork before. But yeah, it just felt like things were kind of laid out a little clinically, and that's not to say there wasn't some rhythm and interest, but yeah, I just ultimately I didn't get very emotionally involved with much of the artwork, except my personal favourite, John Raffman, who's somebody that I'd never really spent a lot of time with the work, and I was completely blown away the scale of it was a video, in fact, you very kindly, Dream Journal 2016 to 19. It was on a kind of epic scale, and there was a whole environment created for people to view it, which was less important, I felt, but the content really drew me in. This kind of ever-evolving, nightmarish dream scene done in a kind of gamer's graphic just felt totally on point and totally absorbing, and I want to think a lot more about John Raffman as a result.
And how was it curated? Was it given its own room? I feel like I am really annoyed because this is another situation where there's these pieces that people are people's favourites, and you actually somehow managed to miss them in the.
It was another
show.
room where you went into a curtained space, and I think he'd maybe done some graphic for the wall, and maybe the seating was specific. I don't actually remember what I sat on, or maybe I just sat on a carpet, but it was huge, and the scale of the screen was very big. I don't know if it would have felt very different on a different scale. I know that he did a VR. Virtual reality headset for Freeze a couple of years ago, which was a huge hit, but I never got the headset on my head. But investigating him a little bit further, this is something that he's been engaged with. But yeah, I think I've said this word before, but it was incredibly generous.
I did feel like going through the exhibition, there was so much stuff that I felt like I was particularly struck by video work, and I wonder whether that was because often it was given its own room and just was able to capture your attention in this more almost demanding way because it's been shown. So there was the Hittish Dale, which had its own space, and I really liked, which is sort of these weird, I guess, algorithmic growing nature plant flower things happening on these screens sort of set up on scaffolding, and there's sort of this almost like kitschy smoke filling the floor, and everyone's sat around in the middle of this sort of like quite nicely, I thought, built up space watching a video about conversation with a neural network or with an artificial intelligence supposedly. And I think that it's sort of the extension of a show which has been on recently, The Serpentine, in a slightly different way, which was set up quite similarly.
Yeah,
and I just thought,
the gossip is that there was a show she was supposed to do at The Serpentine and then couldn't do because of health and safety issues to do with, like, you know, there's those like sort of bags of soil and scent floating around in the thing.
I didn't know about that gossip, so The Serpentine couldn't accommodate her. That's interesting. It was definitely more developed, I thought, than The Serpentine show, but it had the same ideas. It sort of like felt like it was in the same world. I liked both of them. I thought they were both great. And there was one other, I have it written down, Apichatpong Wirasetakul, who is a Thai independent filmmaker, and he actually collaborated with this Japanese artist called Tsuyoshi Hisekado, who does these soundscapes and spatial structures. I don't know whether you remember it. It was this really disorienting, again, sort of room off from the main area, and it had this video of a woman in bed in a forest, sort of being projected onto a slanted wall, which had a hole in it, and another, I think, separate projection with fire, like a fire, and there's this sort of dreamlike space that it created, and you went behind the wall, and there was this almost like cabin space with light bulbs, and I loved it just because in the context of all of this like virtual reality, it felt almost like virtual reality goes back to real again. I don't know, I felt like I was in a video game in real world.
It's just like this little folded away kind of.
And I thought it was just done really well. It made me think of like and there's sort of this room that you go into gets smaller and smaller as you walk into it. It reminded me of, I don't know whether you've seen that original Willy Wonka film with Gene Wilder. Yes. And there's that amazing scene where everyone goes into this room, and then as they walk into the room is getting smaller until they all get to a door, and it's about the size of a mouse hole. And they just had that like weird dreamlike scale game.
And what really stood out to me in that space, I suppose, so much of the experience of being at like a like huge art fair like the Biennale, or it's not an art fair technically, I guess, is that sort of very frantic movement around, and then like in that space, I think because of the sort of almost like the emptiness of the room, or like there was no sort of like obvious like central, this is the art, it's just you're in it, this is the room. People would move around it in a really kind of uncertain way, and you could see the whole sort of rhythm of the whole sort of unfolding event that is the Biennale. It totally shifts in this like one space. And I think that was, if we're talking about sort of the difficulty of doing justice to an artwork or allowing it to sort of someone to like immerse themselves in it and really grab it, that seemed like a really sort of clever proposition almost to sort of move around that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Completely. In fact, actually, that maybe is a nice opportunity to sort of zoom out and talk a little bit about what you sort of think about the Biennale or the Biennale structure, and what you think it sort of offers and what it's doing and how it fits into the wider art ecosystem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one conversation I had was somebody just said, I think it's time that this Biennale moved somewhere else, and gave Venice a break. And although there is obviously the architectural structure of the Giardini and all these national pavilions, I mean, they're probably quite historically contested, as in, there's all sorts of complicated histories, which one is, aware of lots of revisionist history and complicated power structures that people are trying to play down, or
because there's just a character. So there's these these permanent art gallery buildings that are all littered around this park, and places like Britain have this great position at the top of like an avenue of trees and a marble mausoleum sort of like structure, and then you have places like Scotland who have to be off-site and somewhere else, or far at the other end of the park there's like the Egypt Pavilion, which is like much smaller and harder to get to, and it sort of reflects power structures.
Indeed, very much so. And it was quite an interesting proposition from someone who shall remain nameless, but just the idea maybe that Venice is literally sinking under its own tourism, and maybe you do the Venice Biennale, you rename it, and you do it every 10 years like Documenta, and you actually give somewhere else a chance to live and breathe this situation. I mean, I know there are nomadic biennales like Manifesta, and the Venice Biennale is incredibly iconic. But the other, I heard a little gossip too, which is apparently people could buy tickets to the professional preview for $300, euros, I don't know. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, it was so oversubscribed. I never experienced it so bad, where you have to queue for 2 hours at the professional preview for mildly popular pavilions. And obviously that's woe is me. I had to queue for something, but it really felt, it feels quite suffocating. I'm sure for the rest of the time I've visited the Biennale before, off times, or gone in September, and it's really nice, and you're the only person, you're strolling around, and you have a very different experience.
Because it is a really strange experience, this like event where everybody descends en masse to this one place, and the idea being, I mean, would you say that the idea with something like Venice is that all of these people come to one place and these conversations are facilitated? Like, that's the idea behind it, and everyone can talk about the art, and maybe it's a snapshot of the art being made in the world at one time, every 2 years. I guess the thing that's striking when you go for the first time, which is what happened for me this time, is there's just so much, as you said, like scaffolding. There's so much other than that going on that actually has just been entrenched, and it's so often actually about like where you go and who you know, but also like, I don't know, I just found it really weird, actually. It's a really weird world.
Yeah, and it's odd how quickly Venice just becomes like the wallpaper for it. Doesn't feel real after 10 hours. You're just there. It is
jogging past all these ancient churches to try and get to, I don't know.
But I do think, I mean, I was trying to think in terms of just having had the opportunity to go over the years. I mean, one really extraordinary experience was when Kerith Wyn Evans produced a work that happened in the Venice Opera House, and things like that, which actually do use the infrastructure of Venice, and something that exists in a usable building. That, I mean, it was a very experimental music and film piece. It wasn't strictly speaking opera, but it just was so extraordinary for it to be in that situation at that time. At that moment, Venice didn't feel like wallpaper. It felt like a sort of living, breathing kind of extraordinary host to a project. And I don't know. I mean, I personally I've got giant fatigue with performance art, although I find it interesting. But any more performance art with choreographed dancing, and I just give up. It's too much, and it was everywhere, and I find it has very little to say to me at this point, but perhaps
I think you're quite into the performance art scene.
I mean, the thing I wanted to elaborate is just on, I suppose it speaks to both the sort of the weirdness that you're talking about, and also this bizarre phenomena where this whole kind of like separate, like entirely separate being from the actual city of Venice just sits up and like exists relatively independently from...
What do you mean a separate being?
Well, I mean, it's like when you're talking about, and you just jog past the churches and it's a backdrop, and it's just like you're in this space in a totally different way. There's a kind of like sort of parallel world that sort of unfolds, and I feel like there was some art like this time around, or some projects which sort of made some attempt to engage with that in some way, which I thought was quite interesting. Like there's a good bit in the Lord Provost video, Deep Sea Blue Surrounding You, the French Pavilion, where it showed you how to like sneak in to the Giardini, where you could go and like jump over a wall.
So that was worth the 2 hour queue.
And I thought that was really funny. That was really good. And then
so you go in and you're watching this video
which you've
within the pavilion.
You've stood for like 2 hours to queue into the pavilion. You stood for 2 hours to queue to like get into the Giardini itself.
It was this queue, sort of this horrific
and then you get
queue
this like
down
sort of
the
payoff
road.
where it's like here's how you don't have to do that next time.
Yeah, and the whole video was about this group of people on,
Yeah, this kind
on
of
an odyssey
journey
towards
to Venice,
the
yeah.
Giardini, right? Over the course
Yeah.
of maybe weeks, or what you imagine it to be.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I thought that was quite site-specific in a way.
And then the other thing that's worth mentioning in that regard is the Lithuanian pavilion, Sun and Sea, which was set up in this military base, sort of adjacent to the Arsenale, which I think I spoke to the curator Lucia Pietruschi last week, and she was talking about this process of having to collaborate with all these people, these military officials who are totally outside of the kind of, you know, art world milieu, and try to build up a sort of dialogue and understanding about what it is you're doing. And then they also had another project where the catalogue was produced via this local organization that works in a prison in Venice and tries to sort of give people work and give people projects and sort of launch. So there's this whole sort of prison community which was involved in the production of this art catalogue, which is a vinyl record. And I thought those kind of projects about how can this thing sort of, you know, be in dialogue with this place rather than just using it as a sort of scenic backdrop are maybe some sort of
Absolutely
important ideas to consider.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
That does sound interesting, and that makes me think actually of the conversation I was having with the artists at the Nordic Pavilion, who gave a sort of Finnish artist duo called Nabtiri, and they're two artists, Jan Nab and Maria Thierry, and they'd out of wood they'd made this compost structure. I think I maybe talked about it at the time.
It's a great story.
And it's made out of these mooring poles, actually, that are littered all around the canals, and they get eaten by this naval shipworm. That means that they have to get replaced by the Venetian civic service. And they'd found out about this, and they'd sourced this wood as part of a long 8-month process of trying to sort of fit their environmental art into a sense of like actually being grounded in Venice. And they'd made this compost, but because it was set ever so slightly outside of the art gallery, and because it involved all of these weeds growing out of the soil, everyone was just treating it as like a flower planter, and you could see all these like illy coffee cups thrown into it. And people, while we were chatting and sort of pointing at the artwork, there were people just sort of sat on it, looking at their photos on their phone with no idea, which was both really great and also quite depressing, because it was these people just littering in this environmental art and then going in and like taking selfies with the enviro art. I don't know, I found it kind of... But I really respected their commitment to making something that was in conversation with the actual place. That anecdote, I guess, that highlights how much work we have to do in the way that we move beyond just a superficial engagement with art in terms of climate crisis, generally. I like that. That's ending on a kind of, if we draw it to a close, it ends on quite an optimistic note.
I think before we end, though, there's something we have to talk about.
Oh, yeah, we can...
Which is
the refugee vote?
The refugee vote.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I was just on the phone to a friend who we hooked up with in Venice, who introduced us lots to wonderful people, and her first comment was the vote was such an enormous waste of money and such a terrible positioning and so easily ignored, or just a selfie backdrop. I mean, on paper you can imagine, because
should just describe before to clarify what it is. So the artist Christoph Buchel brought a refugee boat, I think, that had been the site of, I'm not 100% sure about the number, but anywhere between 100 and 1,000 deaths. And had gone through an enormous bureaucratic process of getting this boat from the Italian officials brought to Venice and then displayed it as an artwork. And it's been a sort of divisive presence.
Major point of controversy.
Major point of controversy. Some people saying it's bringing attention to something that should get attention, and other people saying it was incredibly like peak art world insensitivity, where you just get something that's really not... people taking selfies with it and all kinds of inappropriate activities.
I mean, what I was going to say, well, because the Arsenal exists alongside, is a boatyard basically, you know, it kind of makes perfect sense, and so much better than those, you know, ghastly sort of hand sculptures and all sorts of things that exist around there. In lots of ways, it kind of made a lot of sense to bring it there and to put it there and to talk about European migrant crisis and really badly dealt with situations, but it was completely undocumented. Lots of people knew about it, but And I found it quite moving to see the scale of this ship and what it was, but if I hadn't just happened to read that this existed, and somehow I think I overheard someone say, "Oh, that's the ship," I would have walked past it thinking it was just a ship.
Completely.
And I understand people in their Ferragamo trainers sitting down, not understanding what it was or noticing it.
Maybe there were these queues to go to the restaurant. There was like a marquee right next to it. There was a toilet nearby, and a lot of people who maybe had actually walked up and sort of clocked it, maybe even had a conversation about it, but just the fact that it was right next to a thoroughfare meant that, you know, even if you had originally thought, oh, that's really significant and quite moving, after about 10 minutes you were just getting about, trying to get your sandwich, trying to rehydrate, not thinking about the boat.
Yeah. But was it an official part of the curated exhibition? It was.
It was, and I think the fact that that's not clear is also quite significant, right?
Yeah, maybe that's the odd thing about it, because I do think it has some power and input, but I totally understand how kind of wrong it can be read.
I guess to try and put myself in the curatorial shoes, I was trying to do a lot of work for it. I was almost thinking to myself, maybe the cues and the inattentive people walking by, that's the point, and there's sort of there's this like wider structure here, and the
these kind of problems are ignorable
precisely.
But then in room.
There's a part of me thinking like maybe I'm doing that thing where I do a lot of work for something that actually did not have that level of forethought attached to it originally. I don't know. It certainly don't think that I have had any conversations with people about that ship that are like, oh, what is Italy's migrant crisis policy? How might we make sure that something like this doesn't happen again? I think all the conversations I've had have been like hot or not. Is that okay? That seems a bit control. Are we okay with that? It was a bit provocative, but it hasn't actually been, I guess, managed in a way that has. I think obviously Christoph Buchel has been really difficult to contact, and that might be because he doesn't want to he's wary of there being all of this controversy around it. But I think also if he had been doing more like proactive conversations about it, he'd be getting the conversation with something
I also
useful.
think in the light of something like forensic architecture coming much more into the public realm, having been nominated for the Turner Prize and having an amazing show at the ICA, that kind of extremely in-depth look. I mean, they did deal with the European migrant situation. You have something which goes deep into analysis and visuals and is an ongoing process-led kind of political force that's trying to change, get itself legally inveigled and things. Whereas, the ship just kind of sits there. I mean, I feel like it deserves some credit, but maybe not enough was done to situate it. Maybe the art world needs some more help, or visitors do.
I just wonder what it would have, how I feel like that could have been engaged with if you'd put that ship somewhere with maybe with at least some clear signage, maybe had it somewhere difficult to get to, had interviews
that
with
people made a pilgrimage
artists
to see or something to some extent.
Yeah, I think it was certainly a very galvanizing site for the exhibition.
But it's weird because at the other side of the Arsenal, as you kind of exited, there was this kind of odd part facade of Neverland, of Michael Jackson's Neverland, which I really liked. I actually don't know who the artist is or why it was there, or whether it was part of the exhibition or just a random thing, but that of course you immediately knew it was a reconstruction and it's a sculpture, and of course there's enough controversy around Michael Jackson that you kind of draw the
you join the dots.
Join the dots, that's what I was looking for. Whereas this kind of salvaged piece of actual history.
I mean, I guess it sort of circles back to how we started off, where we were talking about the sort of the looseness of this, of the sort of curation of the exhibition as a whole, and some of the sort of risks and consequences of that. And that almost seems to be that sort of encapsulated with some of the problems we're talking about with this boat now, where what the boat's doing is it's like, well, you can't, this is just unspeakable. All you can do is just sort of like move this object and present that, because this is too complex and too like ethically like sort of
Yeah, right, exactly. So, well, don't we live in interesting times where we can have this boat
where it's
and what
actually
it represents?
the challenge is, how do you speak about the unspeakable rather than how do you just like ship in a boat to like do the work for you, where like hundreds of people died, and put your name on it as well, is I guess another really weird thing, where like a difference between like forensic architecture and like this is that forensic architecture are like, oh, we're collective, this is what we do, this is what we're about, whereas this is just like, I'm an artist, this is what I'm bringing to the table. Yeah,
this is my found art.
Exactly.
Yeah. Completely. And who knows how this, because the other question is how this exhibition will age over the course of the time it's being shown, but also over the next year, how it will or the next 2 years, how it will be seen in retrospect. And I sort of feel like my initial impression is that this vagueness is sort of representative of a general sense of uncertainty about where we are and what's going on. Like, who knows where we'll be in 2 years' time? And in a way, it's very difficult to put together something that tries to speak to a zeitgeist that is...
No one knows what it is.
No one knows what it is. No one knows where we are. I mean, I feel like we could be in a very different situation in 2 or 3 months' time, and everything will feel very, very different, and so it's difficult to say where we stand. Maybe there's an element of that comes out in the wash. I don't know. But yeah,
one disturbance and shock after another. Let's hope that's not
that is it. As we move from one crisis to another, we suffer one disturbance and shock after another. To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud.